Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. Jeffersonville, Indiana. Thursday, September 11th, 2014. Before dawn, a woman calls 911 and reports that someone is trying to get in despite newly changed locks. Dispatch records the fear. Officers respond. The immediate disturbance subsides. The caller is Tammy Jo Blanton, 46. She is reliable at work, consistent with time, and known to colleagues who expect her to arrive without fail. She has recently ended a relationship and taken basic safety steps, changing locks, setting boundaries, keeping regular contact with the people who would notice if something was wrong. Those are not narrative flourishes. They are control points investigators use to measure risk. Morning comes and the baseline breaks. Tammy Jo does not clock in. A missed shift from a dependable employee is not treated as drama. It is treated as a data point. Coworkers request a welfare check because that is the correct escalation when routine collapses after a pre-dawn fear call. Patrol officers are dispatched to her Jeffersonville residence. A man answers the door. Officers conduct standard officer safety procedures and begin to account for what is verifiable, who is present, what is observable, and whether the scene is safe to enter. From that knock forward, this case follows one address and one linear clock. No side locations, no alternate track. To keep the record clean, the scope is set now. Jurisdiction, Jeffersonville, Indiana. Date, September 11th, 2014. Victim, Tammy Jo Blanton. Documented sequence, early fear report to 911 after a recent breakup and lock change. Missed work shift. Welfare check initiated. Contact made at the residence. There is no speculation here about motive or outcome. The language remains operational: risk window, routine baseline, escalation pathway. The job in this opening segment is to anchor the audience to what can be proven without jumping ahead to forensic interiors or courtroom conclusions. Intimate partner separations are a known period of elevated risk. Safety measures, like changing locks, reduce exposure, but timing still matters, especially in the hours immediately after a confrontation or attempted entry. Investigators in small cities pay attention to those hours because patterns in quiet communities are stable. Deviations stand out. That is why an absence from work, by itself, carried weight here. When the welfare check request hit the board, procedure, not guesswork, dictated the next steps. Make contact, secure safety, preserve anything that may later be evidence. If you are listening with a critical ear, hold on to three fixed markers: the pre-dawn call, the missed shift, the welfare check. These are the pillars of the case timeline. They do not depend on memory or rumor. They live in logs, attendance sheets, and dispatch entries. Everything else that follows, interviews, lab work, legal process, will be built on top of those pillars. The aim is not to perform a story. The aim is to report a sequence that begins with a frightened call and a broken routine in a town where breaks in routine are noticed. The 72 hours before September 11th, 2014 are reconstructed from records, not recollection. Work attendance logs, call timestamps, and preserved messages outline a short sequence: end a relationship, change locks, keep routine, report fear, miss a shift. That progression is measurable, and it is the foundation investigators use to test risk, access, and opportunity without speculating beyond what the documents permit. 2 days out, messages show Tammy Jo Blanton confirming a lock change and setting clear boundaries about unannounced visits. Colleagues remember nothing dramatic in tone. The aim was practical: secure the door, go to work, keep the schedule. Her supervisor's calendar and HR timekeeping reflect consistent on-time arrivals across prior weeks. That baseline matters because any deviation becomes a hard signal. When you build a timeline for a small city, pattern is currency. Within 24 hours of the incident date, communications narrow, brief confirmations about morning start time, no requests for time off, no notice of illness. Phone activity captured through legal process later confirms ordinary, low-volume usage. There is no sudden flurry of outgoing calls to suggest a changed plan. When a person committed to routine keeps sending normal, mundane confirmations, investigators treat that as the intent to appear as scheduled. Early on September 11th, a call to 911 documents fear of a possible attempted entry despite newly changed locks. The dispatch log timestamps the report. Responding officers note the disturbance has tapered. The caller remains at the residence. That single entry, paired with the recent lockwork, is a red flag in intimate partner cases because separation and access control changes often precede escalation. The case file marks this window as critical: pre-dawn contact, then silence, then a missed shift. The clock rolls forward to the workday. Attendance software records a no-show. Coworkers escalate according to policy, requesting a welfare check when calls and texts go unanswered. That is not drama. It is protocol. In towns where schedules don't drift much, a missed clock-in after a fear report is a high-value data point. It compresses the investigative window and focuses resources on a single address and a short band of time. Investigators then align 3 fixed anchors: the lock change, verified by message, and if available, a service receipt, the 911 call time, and the HR no-show. With those anchors, they chart potential access paths. Who had keys before the change, who knew the layout, who understood the routine, and who had reason to appear unannounced. Those are standard questions, but they are only asked after the anchors are set. The order matters because order prevents contamination of memory, of judgment, and later of evidentiary decisions in court. Digital artifacts in this phase are limited but useful. Call detail records confirm when the fear call went out and whether the phone remained active afterward. Text metadata show last sent and last received entries before the workday. Voicemail logs, if present, can establish whether coworkers' calls hit a full inbox or rang through without pickup. None of these items solve a case alone. Together, they define a corridor of time and a degree of access that prosecution and defense will argue about later. For now, they keep the story inside the lines. This reconstruction step is also where investigators deliberately avoid conclusions about intent. The purpose is to establish that a reliable person kept her routine until she couldn't. When routine breaks immediately after a documented fear report, the safest assumption for responders is not that plans changed, but that something intervened. That assumption is operational, not emotional. It ensures the next units treat the residents as a potential scene, secure whatever they can, and preserve anything that may later require forensic analysis. There is a human layer here that deserves a single, clear sentence. Tammy Jo did what safety guidance often recommends: set boundaries, change locks, keep people informed. Not every preventative step eliminates risk, but each step leaves a record. Those records now keep the timeline honest. In a community where neighbors recognize cars and coworkers notice absences, documentation is not just paperwork. It becomes the guardrail when the outcome is disputed and the facts need a spine. By the time patrol is dispatched for the welfare check, the case has enough objective markers to proceed without rumor: a recent lock change, a pre-dawn fear call, and a missed shift by someone who doesn't miss shifts. The gap between those points is measured in hours, not days. Narrow gaps concentrate evidence. Narrow gaps also mean any explanation that requires long detours is less likely. The investigation moves to the door. Patrol rolls on a welfare check in Jeffersonville, Indiana, late morning, September 11, 2014. The address matches the call history you heard earlier. The expectation is simple: confirm safety, clear the run. Officers announce, the door opens, and a man stands at the threshold. Demeanor is noted for the report, nothing more. Standard officer safety steps follow. During a pat-down, they recover a brass knuckle folding knife with what appears to be blood and hair. The item is immediately separated, photographed in place, bagged, and logged. The individual is moved outside, kept within view. The house is quiet. The interior check begins the way it should: slow, methodical, and documented. Entryways are cleared. The back door shows fresh damage consistent with forced entry: a disturbed strike plate, marks along the jamb. Officers call it in and hold the space until investigators arrive. This isn't drama, it's procedure. With a potential crime scene in play, the first priority is to stop contamination. The hallway lights reveal smears and small pools that are photographed before anyone moves further. A senior officer directs a limited sweep for persons in need of aid. No additional people are found. The bathroom draws attention next. A tub is partially covered. At this point, the sweep stops, and the tone changes from welfare check to crime scene preservation. The room is secured, the residence is treated as a single scene with one point of focus. Detectives arrive with a tech team. A log is placed at the threshold. Everyone who enters signs in: name, time, reason. That paper trail matters later in court, and it matters right now to keep the work clean. The initial walkthrough by investigators is documented on video and still photography. Nothing is moved until it's recorded as found. The team notes visible blood on high-touch surfaces, switch plates, handles, nearby walls, and marks each area with numbered placards. They run a light sweep to identify additional stains for swabbing. The condition of the bathroom is captured in multiple angles. Only after the documentation is complete does the medical examiner's staff proceed with their part. Injuries, causes, and any internal findings will be addressed by autopsy and lab protocols. This is not the place for conclusions. The removal is done with care and recorded end to end. In the kitchen, utensils and dishware with apparent blood are photographed on the counter and in the sink. Items are collected one by one, gloved, bagged, sealed, labeled, and the chain of custody is initialized. A small trash receptacle holds tissues with apparent blood. Each is documented separately before collection. The team notes transfer patterns on certain surfaces and a few drip lines across a short span of floor. They don't interpret them on scene, they collect and map. Interpretation belongs in analysis, not during the first pass. Back at the entry, the recovered brass knuckle knife is processed as the primary edged instrument pending lab confirmation. Swabs are taken from visible staining on the handle and blade. A hair fragment, if present, is placed into its own container. The bag seal is signed and dated. Every movement of that evidence from this moment forward will be logged. That's how you keep the courtroom from relitigating the hallway. Detectives step outside to ensure the individual encountered at the door remains available while the residence is processed. They document superficial injury consistent with a recent cut. They do not assign meaning to it on scene. They'll later compare that observation with lab results and any statements given. The goal here is straightforward: capture the observable and preserve the testable. Anything else waits until interviews and forensic reporting. As the house is cleared, attention returns to the point of entry. Damage to the back door area is measured and photographed. Hinge side, latch side, threshold. Whether it's pry damage or brute force is a question for a tool mark exam, and if needed, a door hardware expert. For now, the photographs and measurements lock the condition in time. Exterior approach paths are checked for obvious trace. Nothing conclusive is reported at this stage. The scene perimeter remains small. There is no second location. This is the only interior investigators will process for this case. Scene techs produce a rough sketch with dimensions and the placement of key items: the bathroom location, kitchen counters, sink, trash receptacle, and the path officers took on entry. The sketch is scaled later, but the rough gives context for where photographs were shot and where samples were pulled. Each swab and each item goes into the evidence ledger with a unique number. If you're wondering why this level of detail matters, it's because trials do not replay feelings. They replay records. A clean record is what holds when memories fail. When the medical examiner's team departs with the decedent, the residence transitions from emergency-driven to analyst-driven. Detectives recheck that windows and doors are recorded, thermostat and lights documented as found, and any electronics or devices are noted for later legal process. There's no need to speculate about messages or call content here. That belongs to the warrant stage. What matters is that the devices are identified and preserved where appropriate, and that the scene tells its story without help from guesswork. The final pass is a redundancy check. Are there uncollected stains? Did every photographed item get a corresponding evidence number? Are the log sheets complete? Redundancy saves cases. Once satisfied, investigators close the residence with a secure seal. The team leaves with evidence that will now move into separate lanes: DNA analysis, serology, and later, any tool mark or trace comparisons. Parallel to that, interviews will begin. Words can change, swabs do not. What stands out from this day is clarity. A welfare check led to one address, one interior, and a single documented sequence of recovery and collection. No second scene, no alternate narrative path. The legal process that follows, interviews, charging decisions, courtroom testimony, will stack on top of what was preserved here. If you've followed cases that wobble, it's often because the first hours were messy. This one, for all its gravity, is clean on paper. Clean does not mean easy, it means verifiable. Interviews begin the moment the scene is secured. The male encountered at the residence is separated from the activity, photographed for any visible injuries, and advised of his rights. A recorded advisement and waiver are obtained before questioning. The early goal is narrow. Lock his timeline to the dispatch clock, document his explanation for being at the house, and preserve anything he volunteers before attorneys enter the process. Investigators do not argue facts in this room. They collect statements and freeze them in time so later evidence has something concrete to confirm or contradict. He starts with a version that places him on the property for a benign reason, checking in, trying to talk. He attributes a fresh cut on his hand to an ordinary mishap. When asked about the damaged back door, he pivots. In one account, he says he found the door like that. In another, he implies unknown men were involved. A third line suggests he barely entered. The variations are logged word for word. The interviewers avoid leading questions and keep the structure consistent. When did you arrive? How did you enter? What did you see? Did you handle any objects? The tape runs. The transcript will matter more than impressions. Outside the room, detectives cross-check live against fixed records. The pre-dawn 911 fear report is time-stamped. The welfare request and patrol arrival are time-stamped. Those anchors bracket when the house should have been secure. Inconsistent statements are flagged next to those entries without commentary. The forced entry indicators documented at the back door do not validate the suspect's alternatives on their own, but they narrow what could be true. If a door is damaged after locks were recently changed, access becomes a quantifiable issue, not a debate. Co-workers are interviewed the same day. Their statements are brief and consistent. Tammy Jo Blanton had ended a relationship, changed locks, and confirmed an ordinary start time for work. There were no planned visitors and no agreed-upon morning meeting. Investigators obtained consent or legal process to review recent messages that reflect those boundaries. The tone in those messages is practical: safety, routine, and distance. That tone matters because it contradicts any suggestion she invited company. It also reduces the chance that miscommunication explains the morning. Neighbors are canvassed for sightlines, not gossip. Who saw lights? Who heard a vehicle? Did anyone note sounds at the back of the house? A few offer fragments, nothing that contradicts the locked timeline, nothing that supports the suspect's mention of unknown intruders. The canvass report reflects that absence of corroboration. In cases with small windows of time, the lack of support for an alternate narrative is itself data. Detectives log it and move on. There is no benefit to stretching weak leads. Back in the interview room, the narrative from the male subject shifts again. He names no verifiable third parties. He floats statements that veer into the bizarre, claims about awareness beyond ordinary senses, references to acts that would be confirmed only by forensic examination. Interviewers do not react. They note each statement, ask clarifying questions where policy allows, and end the session when it stops producing coherent, testable information. This is not a place to litigate mental state. That belongs to doctors and later to the court, not to detectives on day one. Clothing worn by the subject is preserved per policy. If a warrant is required for seizure, detectives obtain it. Photographs document the condition of his garments and any staining before collection. Standard swabbing of hands and forearms is completed where allowed. Any visible cuts are photographed with a scale for later comparison to potential tool marks or activity-consistent injuries. The point is not to leap to conclusions, but to capture ephemeral evidence before it is lost to time, washing, or contamination. Parallel interviews extend to the first responders. Body-worn or in-car recordings are pulled and logged so the sequence at the door, the pat-down, and the recovery of the brass-knuckle folding knife are fixed beyond memory. Dispatch audio is preserved to pair with the pre-dawn fear report. Every minute that can be accounted for without relying on a human recollection is banked now to avoid later disputes. Trials attack gaps. The job today is to close them. With the first round complete, the investigative team drafts a working matrix, columns for each statement version given by the male subject, rows for each fixed anchor, pre-dawn call, patrol arrival, door damage, interior collection, and the condition of the subject upon contact. Where versions conflict with anchors, the cells are shaded for follow-up. Where versions are silent, they're marked no claim. This isn't courtroom flair, it's case control. When forensic reports arrive, they will drop into this matrix, and any surviving narrative will have to survive the science. There is a human line to keep in view. Tammy Jo took practical steps. People are often told to take. Set boundaries, change locks, rely on a routine that others can verify. None of it guarantees safety, but all of it leaves a record. Those records, paired with neutral procedure, are what give weight to her side of the story when she cannot speak. The tone stays respectful and clinical because that is how cases avoid collapsing into opinion. The day ends with more questions than answers, but they are better questions than the ones that opened the morning. Who handled the knife? Who had the opportunity to force the back door after the lock change? Whether the subject's shifting accounts can survive comparison to the autopsy and DNA work already in motion. The interview room can produce noise. The lab will sort signal from that noise. The file moves to forensics next. The lab takes over the minute the seal on the residence is signed. Evidence from Jeffersonville travels on a documented chain. Scene tech to evidence custodian, custodian to lab intake to individual analysts. Every transfer has a time, a name, and a signature. That paper trail is not paperwork for its own sake. It's how a courtroom later accepts that what gets tested is exactly what left the scene. The medical examiner conducts the postmortem while the lab begins serology. The autopsy is clinical and complete. Multiple sharp force injuries, clear defensive wounds to the hands and forearms, and internal findings that document the absence of specific organs. The cause of death is attributed to sharp force trauma. Time since death is estimated within accepted parameters based on body temperature, rigor, and scene conditions. Those metrics are noted plainly in the report. They anchor the medical timeline to the dispatch clock that started before sunrise on September 11, 2014. On the bench next to the report, the lab works through the kit of swabs, the recovered brass knuckle folding knife, utensils from the kitchen, and tissues collected from a small trash can. Presumptive testing identifies blood on priority items. Confirmatory testing establishes human origin. Analysts cut the blade and handle of the knife into separate evidentiary fractions to keep touch DNA distinct from victim blood. Swabs from switch plates and high-use areas in the hallway and bath are cataloged under unique identifiers to preserve location context for later reconstruction. DNA analysis proceeds with established STR methods. The victim's reference profile is developed and used as a comparator. On the blade and on several interior surfaces, profiles are consistent with the victim. On the handle of the brass knuckle knife, analysts detect a mixture. The major component is consistent with the victim. A minor component is consistent with the individual encountered at the door when officers arrived. That conclusion is narrowly worded and statistically supported in the lab report. The wording matters because it avoids overstatement while still giving detectives a measurable link between person and instrument. The utensils and dishware tell a parallel story. Apparent blood is confirmed. DNA on select items matches the victim. Presence of the individual encountered at the door is also detected on handling areas where you would expect skin cells to transfer. Rims, grips, though the report is careful to note that touch DNA can be deposited in many ways. Analysts do not claim how or when contact occurred. They establish that contact is supported by the profile. The tissues collected from the trash can carry victim DNA as expected and provide additional material for cross-check if needed. Serology adds one more layer. Blood type and other markers are consistent across the items associated with the bathroom and the kitchen. Transfer patterns photographed at the scene are mapped against the swab results to determine which stains are best suited for quantitation. None of the lab notes draw narrative conclusions. They render a data map. When investigators overlay this map on the scene sketch, the path inside the house becomes more defined, not through speculation, but through what was actually detected and where. The backdoor damage is examined under a separate workflow. Toolmark analysts photograph the latch and jamb, cast the deformed areas, and compare them to known patterns. At this stage, the report is conservative. Damage is consistent with force applied to defeat the latch after a recent lock change. No single mark conclusively identifies a specific tool, but the condition of the hardware matches a forced entry scenario rather than simple wear. That distinction is important in a case where access and permission will be argued later. Toxicology is standard in violent deaths. Samples are screened to rule out substances that could confuse the assessment of behavior or capacity. Results are reported in the medical examiner's packet with the same restraint used everywhere else in this file. The purpose is not to build character. It is to remove avoidable noise when cause and manner of death are weighed by a jury. When the autopsy and priority DNA results are delivered to detectives, they are dropped into the interview matrix created the day before. The subject's claims about minimal entry are compared to the touch DNA on the knife handle and selected kitchen items. Assertions about unknown men are checked against profiles developed from the most probative surfaces. The absence of a credible foreign profile on those items does not prove who did what, but it does limit which story can survive scientific scrutiny. Combined with the defensive wound pattern and the distribution of confirmed victim blood, the weight of the physical record points inward, into the residence, across a short window of time. For Tammy Jo Blanton, the forensic process performs a necessary role. It replaces speculation with sequence. It supports what the scene warned from the start without redescribing that scene or leaning on graphic detail. It also honors a simple premise that matters in every small city where routine is the baseline. Facts outlast memory. In towns like Jeffersonville, that's how a quiet community learns to trust an outcome that will later be read from a bench by following the numbers and the swabs, not the noise. Court control begins long before a jury sits down. After the Jeffersonville scene was processed and the lab reports started arriving, the case moved into hearings that decide what a jury may hear, what it may not, and whether the defendant is fit to be tried. Competency comes first. Doctors evaluate present ability to understand the proceedings and to assist counsel. This is not a verdict on guilt or a ruling on sanity at the time of the crime. It is a threshold test. Reports move under seal. The judge questions the experts and, after treatment intervals and updates, the court rules that the defendant is competent to proceed. Only then does the trial calendar open. With competency resolved, the file enters the gatekeeping phase. Defense and prosecution argue motions that shape the evidence. Statements taken after the arrest are reviewed for Miranda compliance and voluntariness. The state offers recordings and advisement forms. The defense challenges scope and context. The judge admits certain portions and restricts others, drawing lines that the lawyers must respect at trial. Graphic photographs are screened for probative value versus unfair prejudice. The court allows a limited set that documents injuries and corroborates the medical examiner's findings. Cumulative or duplicative images are excluded. The aim is clarity, not shock. Prior bad acts are a separate battleground. The prosecution argues that parts of the defendant's history explain motive, intent, or a pattern. The defense argues that such references would bias the jury beyond repair. Indiana rules require a tight fit. Some background may surface later in sentencing when the judge considers aggravation and mitigation, but the guilt phase is narrower. The jurors will decide this case on what happened in Tammy Jo Blanton's home, anchored by physical evidence, timelines, and testimony established in this record, not on character sketches. Then comes the hard lesson of 2019, a mistrial. During testimony, a witness strayed into information the court had barred. The jury had heard it. The bell could not be unrung. The judge declared a mistrial, discharged the panel, and reset the case. It looked like a detour, but it served a purpose. The restart forced tighter boundaries, clearer witness prep, and a renewed commitment to trying the case on admissible facts only. As the second trial approached in 2020, the rules were fixed and the lanes were clear. The jurors would see the single scene as documented, hear the officers who found a brass-knuckle folding knife during a safety pat-down, and review the forensic results, cause of death by sharp force trauma, defensive wounds, DNA mixtures linking the victim to the blade and the defendant to the handle. They would also hear the shifting statements and the limits placed on those statements by the court's pretrial rulings. What they would not hear was as important as what they would: inadmissible history, excluded speculation, and any evidence that risked inflaming rather than informing. This is the value piece for any community that has to watch a violent case move through the system. Trials do not exist to match public emotion. They exist to test evidence under rules. Gatekeeping can feel slow, even technical, but it's the reason a verdict, whatever it is, can stand up on appeal. The guardrails built here are what keep a single case from splitting into two competing stories. The retrial opens in September 2020 with the ground rules already set. Jurors are sworn, instructed to decide facts from evidence alone, and told that certain material exists but will not be shown because the law requires it. The prosecution's case-in-chief proceeds in a straight line: first responders, scene processing, and then the lab. Each witness is confined to what they personally did or observed, nothing more. Exhibits are admitted in the order the court cleared in pretrial: limited photographs, chain of custody forms, and the reports that connect collection to testing. Patrol officers testify first. Their job here is narrow: establish the welfare check, the man at the door, the safety pat-down, and the recovery of a brass-knuckle folding knife that was immediately bagged and logged. They describe visible damage to the backdoor hardware without speculating about tools. Cross-examination presses them on procedure, how long they were inside, who moved where, whether anyone could have tracked material across floors. The answers stay inside policy. Command, contain, document, and defer interpretation to the lab. Crime scene personnel follow, building the link between discovery and the evidence locker. They walk the jury through the entry log, the photo sequence, labeled placards, and the bag seals signed at collection. A scene tech explains why certain stains were swabbed and others photographed only, and why tissues, utensils, and high-touch surfaces were prioritized. The point is not drama, it's provenance. Any break in that paper trail would matter. There isn't one. The medical examiner's testimony is clinical and brief. Cause of death is sharp force trauma, with defensive injuries consistent with struggle. Internal findings are reported in the restrained language the court approved. No narration is added, no images beyond what the judge allowed are shown. Jurors are reminded that their task is not to react to injury but to weigh proof. The DNA analyst is the state's cleanest line. Short tandem repeat profiles are explained in plain terms, along with mixture analysis and statistics. The victim's profile appears on the blade and on selected interior surfaces. The handle yields a mixture in which the victim is the major contributor and the defendant is supported as the minor. The analyst does not claim certainty beyond the numbers. Defense cross focuses on transfer and timing, how touch DNA can move, how long it persists, and whether profiles alone can prove when contact occurred. The analyst holds position, what the data show, and only that. Statements come in with the court's limits attached. The jury hears the defendant gave multiple versions regarding why he was at the residence and how the back door looked. They hear that some remarks were unusual, but only the portions the judge permitted. Jurors are instructed not to consider excluded matters or speculate about what they did not hear. The state argues that shifting accounts set against fixed clocks and physical findings reveal inconsistency. The defense answers that stress, mental health, and confusion explain variance, and that the state has not eliminated reasonable doubt about intent or sequence. Before resting, the prosecution ties its exhibits to the timeline: the pre-dawn fear report, the morning welfare request, the door damage consistent with forced entry after a lock change, the autopsy's cause and manner, and the DNA matrix that puts the victim's biology on the blade and the defendant's on the handle. The defense calls its own witnesses to humanize the accused, to question reliability, and to suggest alternative pathways for transfer and contamination. Expert testimony touches competency history but stays within the narrow bounds the court set. Closing arguments preview the instructions the judge will soon read. Presumption of innocence, burden of proof, elements of murder and burglary, and how to evaluate credibility and expert opinions. The panel retires with notebooks full of exhibits, told to reach a unanimous verdict if possible and to notify the court if they cannot. This is the point where a community wants answers, and the law insists on patience. The jury room is where facts are separated from speculation, where lab sheets outweigh rumor, and where a single case remains a single case. No second scene, no second ending, only the record. The second jury did its work in September 2020 under strict instructions. They had the timeline, the single documented scene, the autopsy, the DNA mixtures, and the defendant's shifting statements, only the portions the court allowed. Deliberations ended with a clear result: guilty of murder and guilty of burglary, not guilty on the sexual assault count. On September 18, 2020, the four-person read the verdicts in open court. No alternative narrative remained that could survive the record. Sentencing followed in October. Victim impact statements were brief and direct, describing a colleague and friend who did ordinary things that keep communities running. Show up, help out, keep promises. The judge addressed the law and the facts: extreme violence, the forced entry after a recent lock change, the forensic proof that traced what happened inside the home. The court imposed life without parole on October 13, 2020. In plain terms, there would be no release. Appeals tested the structure, not the emotion. The defense argued competency, evidentiary limits, and fairness. Indiana's highest court reviewed the gatekeeping and the trial record, then affirmed the conviction and the LWOP sentence in May 2023. With that ruling, the case reached legal finality. As of September 18, 2025, nothing has changed. Joseph Oberhansley remains incarcerated under a sentence that does not end. The outcome stands because the process held, clean scene work, guarded chains of custody, conservative lab language, and a courtroom that kept speculation out. There is a human point to close on, and it is not theory. Tammy Jo Blanton took steps safety advisors recognize. Set boundaries, change the locks, keep a routine others can verify, call for help when something feels wrong. Those actions did not erase the risk, but they left a record. That record, timestamps, swabs, controlled testimony, protected the truth when she could not. In towns like Jeffersonville, ordinary systems notice when a dependable person goes missing from the pattern. That vigilance mattered here. Coworkers escalated a missed shift, officers treated a welfare request like it might be the start of a case, and investigators resisted shortcuts. Good practice did not prevent a homicide, but it did prevent the story from splitting into rumor and doubt. If there is a lesson worth keeping, it is practical and immediate. When separation turns tense, minutes count. Document boundaries. Tell someone you trust. Call early. 911 is not overreacting when a door that should hold starts to move. And for those around the person at risk, treat the small signals like the start of your responsibility, not the end. A call, a welfare request, a knock at a door, none of it feels heroic. But in the files that outlast us, those are the choices that keep a case and a community honest. Looking back on Tammy Jo's story, what strikes me most is how quickly ordinary life can unravel when violence goes unchecked. Boundaries, routines, even a call for help, all of it matters. But it also reminds us that community responsibility is just as critical. No one should carry the weight of fear alone. My question for you is simple. How do you think we can do better at recognizing the warning signs before it's too late? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your perspective and where you're watching from. And if this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next case we cover together.